Hello, everyone. I'm here with Dr. Laurie Johnson. Laurie, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. I'm interested in your podcast and just your perspective too. As an anthropologist, I like anthropologists. I'm a political scientist. So we're in this together, right?
Yes, I feel like all of us social scientists are in this together, trying to understand everything that's happening in the world and has been happening throughout history. It's a lot, and of late,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. I think it's
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of an all hands on deck kind of situation. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
it is.
So, do you want to maybe talk about, maybe give a brief discussion? So, you do a lot of work in political science. You've done a lot of research on the academic side. You have your own YouTube channel and like More an Academy, and have started some groups in the agribusiness. Can you maybe give a brief description of like what made you passionate to do political science and to do this kind of work?
Yeah, so yeah, not to go too far back for too long, but I feel like I've always been interested in politics. I grew up in Illinois, and my dad was political. He was a union teacher in a public school, and so I grew up with a lot of political talk. And I wanted to be a journalist, so I thought, well, I need to get some political science training because I wanted to do political journalism. And then just doing it, I just really clicked with it, and particularly political philosophy, because I didn't have any idea ahead of time, but it turns out that I enjoy and I'm fairly good at abstract thinking, right? So, like, that just sort of dawned on me as I got my education and people started to say, hey, you should do this. And so, there wasn't anything better to do back in the late '80s and into the '90s. We were we were in a recession, so I like to tell people like I didn't make this decision in a super conscious way. Like if people ever worry, do you need to know what you're going to do when you're 16 or something like that? I didn't know what I was going to do until I got my master's degree, and then it was sort of like, well, this seems to be the most reasonable route. I sort of decided I won't be a journalist. I'll do this because the route was open. So, but it turned out that I love this, and I do think that political thinking, political ideology, and political ideas generally are are the most important for understanding why people do the things they do at the level of the tribe and the state,
Hmm.
like the at the collective level. And without a knowledge of those things, you really don't have any idea, right? So, like, everybody's a champion for their field, but I feel like political philosophy slash ideology is kind of the architectonic field. I was convinced to that because, what does everybody appeal to when they decide to take some sort of action? Not that it's their fundamental, whatever their underlying motivation may be that's unspoken, but what do they appeal to and what gets other people on board? But political and social ideas. So that's how I got interested in this, and then I started out as primarily researching actually international relations theory and Thucydides, and sort of bringing in political philosophy into international theory because I was good at that, and it was a good way to get tenure. But then I moved to straight political theory. And for most of my career, I've published in the area of classical liberal theory and kind of developed a critique of classical liberal theory, social contract theory. And then in the last few years, I've moved into this space, kind of building on that, of, trying to understand ideological extremism, sort of the decline of liberal democratic politics, why it is that some people just, or many, maybe most people, end up becoming hyper politicized in a society like ours, and framing their friendships and relationships and their economic choices and everything else around their political views, which I think is really abnormal as far as like the vast scope of human history. But you can maybe tell me if that's true. But it feels weird to me, and so I wanted to try to figure out like why that is, and that led me down the path of political psychology and the idea of mass psychosis. So I published a book on ideological possession and the rise of the new right with Rutledge in I don't forget exactly when it was, but I think 2019. And then my latest book is The Gap in God's Country, a longer view on our culture wars in 2024 with Stock. So that's how I got there. And then along the way, as I've kind of opened up to new areas of thinking, including, other fields of study to gain information, I've made friendships and colleagues out of people from different walks of life, different fields. And we have formed more or less study groups, reading groups, and those have morphed into the Morin Academy. So we can talk more about that, but it all kind of, if you look back on it, it all kind of makes sense. But I had no idea I was going to end up here at the beginning.
That's awesome. Yeah. I mean, I can relate to that. I think I also, when I first went to grad school, I was just learning the profession I ended up working in. And this can happen. I'm glad that you've been able to chart this course. And also, like you, I am super interested in why people make the decisions that they make. And anthropology often maybe focuses on more day-to-day levels than the level of the tribe and the state, though there are many anthropologists who also study that. But it's a very similar set of questions. Yeah. You were talking about this kind of brought you into trying to understand why people think the way they do. Based off of your studies with that, what do you think about kind of some of the current political trends in the United States? In your studies, what have you learned that kind of help you make sense of what's going on?
Sure. Well, so first of all, taking a step back and looking at the global picture is actually useful here, because you would think that this ideological polarization in kind of the rise of nationalism or populism, nationalism, that was an American phenomenon. And that there's something peculiar about things that are going on in America. Now, it's true that still to this day, America kind of leads the world in certain respects, for good or ill. But if you look at the global picture, the same sort of politics has been happening in many, many places around the world at around the same time. And so you have to ask yourself, what is it that influences Polish politics or Turkish politics or Israeli politics in the same general way that it's influencing American politics? And that leads you to global economics, right? Because there's not a whole lot else that kind of like ties all these different people together. And so it makes sense to look at that big picture of, we've moved to a very globalized economy, and it's very capitalist in a way. It's a new kind of capitalism, maybe than people at least romantically hark back to in America. It's where most of the manufacturing is done elsewhere, but it's still very much a capitalist system, and it involves a lot of inequality, a lot of unseen people who do an awful lot of very low paid grunt work, both here and abroad. It involves a lot of dislocation, which is something that I spend a lot of time on in the book, where people, even if it's just internally, but a lot of times it's externally, are moving and shifting and changing and adapting constantly to try to figure out how to survive in a rapidly changing economy with a tremendous amount of automation at this point that is just
Mhm.
escalating, continually. Now we just in the past couple of years have really started to feel the brunt of artificial intelligence in this country. It's just the latest example of the social society churning effects of automation that is born of capitalism, right? And so it dislocates and uproots people. I forget the thinker, anthropologist, but came up with the term root shock. I quote this person in my book. Is another way of like saying the same thing. You take a plant out of one location and you try to plant it in another location, and it looks like it's about to die, and sometimes it does, because the new soil and the new conditions and just the fact of uprooting is really, really hard on that plant. But yet we expect people to be able to kind of endlessly adapt. And then when they don't, we in a liberal country such as ours always blame the individual. So it's their responsibility to figure it out, to adapt, to get smart, to get more education, to train themselves, and to be on top of this curve. But human beings weren't built. Nothing, no organic being was built to change that rapidly. And so you get, from all of these dynamics, a lot of anxiety, frustration, anger. And then that's preyed upon very easily by demagogues, right? When people are unhappy, there's always sociopathic people, probably a lot of them, that zoom in and they give people like the information that will suit their purposes so they can politically and economically take advantage of that level of anxiety and insecurity. Everywhere from, the people selling MREs on the internet to, the very top of the political food chain, to the pastors, who take advantage of people in the pews and so on. I think that is the economy. It's not the only thing, but it's a big, big thing, right? That is influencing all this. And then you have people who take advantage of that and they put names and ideological labels on these fears and direct these fears into our political system. And it comes out in identity politics, in demagoguery, in populism, and all of that. So this is not quite economic determinism that I'm talking about. I'm just saying that we usually downplay economics in a liberal country, and we say, it's our individual choices, or there's stupid people making stupid political decisions. And I don't think that's true. I don't think people are any dumber or smarter than they've ever been.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I do agree. I don't think there's been a fundamental change in like how well people are able to think. I do, and I've seen, I like, there's a lot going on globally that I think seems to feed into the United States. Like the U.S. is becoming, or well, it's kind of always been for at least a half century, but it's almost becoming more and more of a, from a global perspective, of a consumerist economy, focused on consumption, where a lot of resources get channeled into the United States, and a lot of primary production happens globally. I mean, that trend is very old. I mean, you could go back to the colonial era for that. So that's centuries in the making. But it does seem like that some of these big picture economic changes have significantly impacted people's life prospects, and then how they think about political behavior, or how they think about politics. Or yeah, what do you think? How has all this played out in the United States in recently? We'll say the last in this century.
Yeah, right. Well, starting around at least by the 40s, post-war, you know, we moved in the bickering direction, right? The government programs as well as the war gave the United States an economy, a huge economic boost, but also we had global supremacy politically at that point too, militarily. And so that gave us a real jump start into that consumer culture. So, I mean, one of the things that I talk about in the book is how in the 50s, the United States made a pretty rapid cultural shift to new values where, subsistence agriculture and sort of rustic life was looked down upon as not sophisticated enough and not good enough. And, we deserve better and our kids deserve better. And so I look at, of all things, I look at the, Leave It to Beaver TV show because it sort of exemplifies this family. I don't know how many people know this, but Ward Cleaver was the patriarch of the family, and he was the sole breadwinner in the family, which was kind of an anomaly. Women and men both worked in subsistence farming, of course, but in this new age, the ideal was for the wife to stay at home and wear pearls and look great and, be a mom when her kids were home from school. And the guy would work at, Ward he left his family farm and did not go back. And he was a veteran, so he got the GI Bill. And he went off and he got a philosophy degree, of all things, but then he went into marketing. And so his whole lifestyle was built on marketing, products to people, coming up with advertising campaigns. And that's how they afforded this nice little house with a white picket fence. And June could stay home with the kids. And the kids could just go off on larks, for the first time ever. This family, though not wealthy, this American family could have kids that do nothing prior to going to college. And then they go to college and hopefully be like their dad. But, just went and had fun. Whereas previously they would have been learning how to work, So this was a radically different way of life that was extolled to people. And the price of that was largely, not working with your hands, which is both good and bad, but you basically lose some fitness and you lose any sort of understanding of how your food is grown. And maybe what the economic basis of your wealth, and whoa, my cat is going crazy here. Hold on, maybe do you mind if I
Yeah, you're fine.
Away? Okay, you're gonna go to kitty jail.
She wants you to work with your hands to pet her and give her attention.
Apparently so. So the values were supposed to change, right? So this TV show was one of the first therapeutic TV shows that taught the American family to value things and social, status for middle class people. This new idea of the middle class as kind of very upwardly mobile, aiming at the upper class, and the accoutrements of that were consumer products, and the wife was there to ideally purchase them, right? And so, our consumer marketing economy got off to a great start, aiming its predatory advertisements at women and kind of idealizing this way of life. So I think that that detachment, that a growing middle class, professional class in particular, that detachment that developed from, knowing where food comes from and how things are made, that has just kind of continued, right? And now a whole society is becoming used to not seeing that, right? We have very few people farming, and most of those farmers are not directly growing our food, by the way. That's coming from other countries. And, we get a lot of things at stores, but most of them are made elsewhere by people we don't see. And our economy has become not only consumerist, but also vectoralist. Mackenzie Rourke coined the term vectoralism, and I kind of buy into that. We have a whole layer of economy which hires a lot of professional people that is all about just being the interface between people
Mm-hmm.
and things or people and services, right? And this has gained us a lot of wealth, but it's about ready to be automated, I think, right? So like the days where people could make a living in the vectoralist economy, I think, are coming to an end. And this is, I think there's a consciousness, a growing consciousness of this, right? That this is a game we may not be able to win
Mm.
ultimately. And maybe a fool's errand. Like this got started with Alexander Hamilton, maybe way back at the founding, this idea that we had to be powerful, that we had to be a commercial power, that we had to be competitive the world over, that it wasn't good enough to just basically take care of ourselves. We had to do a whole lot more. And the price for this has been really disruptive. So I don't know if that quite answers your questions, but you can redirect if you need to.
No, this definitely answers my question. It was a very broad question, so you could go in a number of directions. What you're saying makes total sense. I mean, what I was thinking about with the, I hope I'm saying the word correctly, vectoralist jobs. That seems like a certain set of jobs within the service sector,
Mhm.
which has had a pretty substantial increase in the last several decades as the proportion of jobs that people are doing. And I have seen the rise of, yeah, like kind of interfacing roles. And that's often where a lot of the, I could be wrong about this, but I believe the vast majority of people in the U.S. work in the service sector more broadly. I don't have specifically have data on vectorist, the vectorist portion of it, but
Right.
one thing this does remind me of, I was reading. I'm going to try to find it to link to it. Just keep any listener keep in mind that this particular article was a couple years ago. There was an Economist article I remember very vividly that was talking about the U.S. economy. I think this was probably around 2022, 23, kind of the beginning of the 20 of this decade, and it talked about how it was like the U.S. economy is doing very well in pretty much all metrics. The U.S. economy has shown like a pretty significant overall increase from like GDP, the price parities with foreign currency, most of these types of metrics. And what they said was they went through this, but they were also like, that doesn't necessarily mean that the lives of people like of the average American is doing better, because like you're seeing a significant increase in production, but not necessarily it being distributed in a way that results in typical Americans seeing the benefits of that. And that ranges from their salaries going up, or in comparison to other countries, like they talked about Japan and Europe investing a lot more in public transit infrastructure and these other ways of doing that as well. But this kind of reminds me of that. It seems like with the Hamilton idea, it's like produce more and more, but you end up making a system that isn't necessarily improving people's lives. It's oriented towards producing more and more. Or what do you think? Am I missing the mark on
Yeah.
what you're saying?
No, I think you're right. If you look at the stock market right now, the stock market has almost recovered to its all-time high.
Mm-hmm.
At least the Dow. I think the S&P and the Nasdaq they're kind of in the same pattern, right? There was this dip with all the uncertainty, and it may happen again with Trump and his tariffs and just his general political uncertainty and I guess lack of skill as far as handling politics in this country. But that's pretty much been recovered. Why? Because at this point, the American economy, if you just measure it by like the profits of major corporations, is doing great. It's doing so great you can't hardly even stop it. But and even people who are kind of at the top of the food chain and have, fairly decent professional jobs at these corporations, whether they're hospital, there's a lot of people employed by hospitals, for instance, making great money, but they're mainly corporate hospitals. some of those folks, they don't know, maybe many of them don't know whether they're going to have lifetime job security. And they may also feel like their lives are not their own, right? So even if people make quite a good living, they may not be as satisfied with their work or feel as secure because there's far fewer companies that will just give them sort of a lifetime, you know, job security because they don't know if that job is going to be needed 10 years from now. And they don't want to pay for that. And they don't want to put that investment into those people because they may have to change, right? And get somebody new that knows more. And then you look at all the people below that who are working. This is part of the crisis of universities, right? They're working kind of like mid-level and low-level service and managerial jobs that don't have job security, aren't making very good money. The very large service sector runs on a lot of people just barely, making minimum wage or whatever the market minimum wage is, wherever they are, which is not enough to make a good life and is not secure. And so, yes, we have statistically full employment right now because, like we don't have enough workers. Our birth rate is starting to go down, right? And that's great at one level, but at another level, we've got a lot of dissatisfied people, not to mention a lot of those lower wage workers in the service sector. They're doing jobs they don't like. I don't know how many people I've talked to who say, I don't want to be doing this long term. I want to be doing this. And then they come up with, something that they actually like to do. Like the last guy I talked to said, I really want to do football coaching. That's my passion. But he's nowhere near football coaching. So people are still having the same sort of dreams that they always had of what they'd like to put their lives into, but they're making coffee at Starbucks, or they're flipping burgers, or they're working at a department store, and that's not giving them satisfaction. Right. And of course, our consumer economy says, well, you don't need to have satisfaction on the job. You can have satisfaction off the job when you can go and you can buy, whatever it is that you can afford. Go to the movies, buy a new outfit, play a video game. Right. But at the heart of it, people are not satisfied with those things because we weren't really built to be satisfied by those types of things. We want community. We want meaning. We want to feel like we're useful, like we're doing something that matters, right? And a lot of these jobs, they only matter to the extent that they feed people and, prevent us from being homeless. But they're not exactly meaningful. Even Ward Cleaver's job was meaningless, right? It was worse than meaningless. It was like destructive to society, right? And a lot of us are in this position of, I'm eking out like a living on selling stuff or talking to people, and I don't even really want to do that. And it might even be harmful to society, right? So it's not good, I mean, I think it's created this kind of deep-seated anxiety, and I see it coming out particularly with like Gen X people and younger people generally. When you interact with them in their place of employment, they just have a real hard time being cheerful, right? Mm-hmm. They have an attitude, and people like to complain about that, but I suspect the reason why I have this attitude is because they just are depressed by it, So yeah, I think we're facing this, it's a lie. It's a lie that we're told that, well, things are booming, the economy is great. Why is anybody complaining? We got full employment, but right beneath the surface, you've got this anxiety. And then when you add to that with a lot of young people, the debt, well, not even just young people, but you got student debt with young people, and then everybody else is in debt. Lots of people never pay off their mortgage, right? So that debt is always hanging over your head, so you can't make your life choices freely. You gotta keep doing what you're doing and not risk unemployment or not take a risk to do something else because that debt is going to kill you, right? So it is not great for a lot of people, and then we shame them if they begin to complain, or we call them socialists or communists because they're kind of interested in not being exploited like this, right? Or they think that somebody who's making billions and billions of dollars in these corporations that they're working for, that some of that should be redistributed to keep the system going, frankly. Because I don't see how else it can keep going if we don't do some more of that redistribution. But we're going in the opposite direction right now.
Yeah, this makes total sense. And this reminds me of one of my friends who works um, in a job similar to what to some of the jobs you mentioned, where giving customer care at a store. He talked about how a number of his colleagues, um, he was like, "You'd be surprised at how many of my colleagues are just high or maybe drunk, but especially high
Mm-hmm.
all day." And he said that this was a defense mechanism for them. It was a way to just, they didn't like doing this day in and day out. It was draining. So it was a way to kind of withdraw so they didn't have to experience it fully, like to almost numb their mind so they don't have to experience it. And um, it's sad. I mean, I think one thing in past decades of U.S. history, I think there was. This obviously will depend on who you're talk to, but I felt like a number of people, they might have a narrative of, I'm on like a stepping stone. So I'm doing this job. I don't like it. It's boring. It doesn't pay well, whatever. It's mine. It's soul crunching, but I'm going to use it to uh, kind of, get a base, get it, elevate myself, and then eventually I'll be doing my dream kind of thing. And
Yeah.
it's a form of the American dream, and whether that was a reality at that time, is, I think, highly debatable. Sociologists will talk about, economic mobility and how viable that actually was. But that aside, I see in the current era, I don't see that as strongly. It seems like there's more of a sense of, I'm stuck and this is never going to get better. There's nothing. And I don't know. I don't think that's a, like, people are just getting more pessimistic. It's that people are getting more aware of some of the things around them that are keeping them in that place. And, things like the cost of living have gone up, and some of these things have made it significantly harder to climb back up.